Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is the place where we take on the complex research, the dense data, and honestly, the often competing scientific narratives, and we try to distill it all down so you, the learner, can walk away genuinely well-informed.
Exactly. And our mission here isn't just to, skim the headlines. It's really to investigate the deep nuances in the evidence, to see where the science is messy and maybe where decades of accepted wisdom might be starting to fray under the pressure of new causal data.
Today, we are wading into one of the most persistent, and I have to say, often heated debates in modern nutrition, the role of vegetable oils in human health. We are performing a deep dive into what we're calling the Linoleic Acid Paradox.
And this is a fundamental conflict. It's one that has, really defined public health recommendations for half a century. The common advice has always been pretty straightforward, right?
Right, swap out the saturated fats.
Exactly. The ones you find in meat, butter, cheese, and replace them with polyunsaturated fats, or PUFAs. The kind found in corn oil, sunflower oil, and especially soybean oil.
And the logic for that advice, on the surface, it seems totally sound. Saturated fat raises LDL cholesterol.
Yep.
High LDL is associated with heart disease. So, therefore, replacing SFA with PUFAs, specifically this molecule linoleic acid, or LA, should lower your LDL and protect your heart. But, and this is the paradox we're starting with, what if this substitution, which, by the way, unquestionably lowers that proxy marker, LDL cholesterol?
No doubt about that.
What if it doesn't actually translate into reliably lower mortality? And, what if it might even be linked to the global rise of the very cardiometabolic diseases we've all been watching explode over the last 50 years?
Linoleic acid, or LA, is the molecule right at the center of this whole debate. It's the predominant omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid in our diets.
Yeah.
It usually makes up something like 80 to 90% of our total dietary PUFA intake.
And it's important to say it is an essential nutrient.
Absolutely essential, meaning your body needs it for cellular function, but it cannot produce it. You have to get it from your diet.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive is very structured. We have to somehow reconcile two completely different stories about the same molecule. First, we're going to investigate the positive side, the seemingly protective role LA plays in type 2 diabetes, and we'll be using some really cutting-edge causal genetic research for that.
Then second, we have to look at the historical and industrial context of the last century. How LA consumption just went completely vertical in the American diet, and it was due to these massive non-health related shifts.
And finally, we confront the contradiction, the controversial data from clinical trials showing that LA's undisputed benefit in lowering cholesterol seems to be, neutralized or sometimes even reversed when you look at the ultimate measure,
Which is actual cardiovascular events and all-cause mortality, the things that really matter.
To tackle this paradox, we are really leaning on the most rigorous methodology available in nutritional epidemiology today, which is Mendelian randomization, or MR. This is how we move beyond just watching what people eat and start to figure out cause and effect.
Exactly. When we rely on the old traditional observational studies, you watch a group of people for 20 years, and you know that the ones who report eating more LA have less heart disease. You always run into confounding factors.
Right. The classic correlation is not causation problem.
It's the central problem. Maybe the people who consciously avoid saturated fats and choose seed oils are also the ones who are just generally more health conscious.
They exercise more, they don't smoke.
They might be wealthier, have better healthcare access, maybe they eat fewer refined carbohydrates. All these variables just cloud the true picture and make it impossible to isolate the effect of the oil itself.
So if that observational data is just too noisy, we need a kind of scientific superpower to cut through those variables and isolate the effect of LA itself. And that's where Mendelian randomization comes in, right?
Precisely. MR it's a really powerful technique that's designed to mimic a randomized controlled trial, but using nature itself. The core idea is that these little genetic variations we all have, they're called SNPs, are fixed at conception.
So you're born with them.
You're born with them. And crucially, they're randomly assorted across the population. And this random assortment is the key, because it means the genes are not inherently related to your later lifestyle factors, like your diet choices, your smoking status, or how much you exercise.
Okay, so researchers can identify these genetic markers that naturally predispose an individual to have, say, higher levels of LA in their bloodstream, and this is totally independent of what they choose to eat for lunch tomorrow.
That's the method. Those genes then become what we call instrumental variables. Since these genes are unrelated to lifestyle factors, they are inherited randomly. Any causal effect they have on an outcome, like your risk for diabetes, is highly, highly likely to flow solely through that LA pathway.
So the genes become the equivalent of the randomized control arm in a study that would be, impossibly expensive or just unfeasible to run clinically over decades.
It's an incredibly elegant concept. It essentially allows scientists to say, okay, we are comparing two groups of people who genetically have high circulating LA versus low circulating LA. And we can be pretty confident that any difference in their outcomes is due to the LA, not their confounding lifestyle choices.
But there have to be checks and balances, right? How do they make sure it's reliable?
Oh, absolutely. To ensure the MR results are reliable, researchers are incredibly strict about the methodology. They have to confirm three core assumptions. First, the genetic markers must strongly and robustly correlate with the exposure. In this case, that means actual circulating LA levels in the blood.
So the gene has to actually do what they think it does.
It has to. Second, they must be unaffected by all those lifestyle and environmental confounders we just talked about. And third, and this is the most important one, the genes must influence the outcome, say, risk of type 2 diabetes, only through the exposure variable, which is LA.
I see. So it can't have some other unknown effect.
It can't have a side door. This level of rigor is what gives us the confidence to start talking about a causal relationship and not just another association.
Okay, so let's turn to the evidence. We're going to start with the good news, or at least the surprisingly strong positive finding concerning LA and our metabolic health. When researchers applied this rigorous genetic technique to study the causal relationship between circulating LA and type 2 diabetes, and they did this in these huge cohorts of European populations, the results were, well, pretty definitive.
They really were. The key finding was a clear inverse causal relationship. What that means is that high levels of circulating linoleic acid significantly reduce the risk of someone developing type 2 diabetes.
And how significant are we talking?
The odds ratio they found indicated that individuals who were genetically predisposed to having higher LA levels had a reduction in their risk of developing T2D that was close to 20%.
Wow, 20%. That's a substantial protective effect, especially when you consider it cuts through all that confounding noise we were just talking about.
It is a very powerful finding, especially for a disease that is, it's reaching epidemic proportions globally. It really suggests that LA, at least in its unprocessed state, and when it's properly metabolized, is an important part of our metabolic maintenance.
So it wasn't just about whether they got diabetes or not, right? Did they look at the actual biomarkers?
They did. Not only did the study show a reduction in T2D occurrence, but the analysis also confirmed that high LA levels effectively lowered the key physical indicators of poor sugar control. So, genetically higher LA was consistently associated with lower fasting blood glucose.
Which is your basic measure of sugar in the blood after you haven't eaten for a while.
Exactly. And it was also associated with lower glycated hemoglobin, or HbA1c.
And HbA1c is the crucial one, really, because it's the long-term marker. It gives you a picture of your average blood sugar control over the previous 2 to 3 months. So the fact that high LA lowers this metric strongly suggests that LA is genuinely helping the body manage sugar over sustained periods.
It does. However, the exact mechanism remains a little bit nuanced. While they saw these strong negative correlations with T2D risk, fasting blood glucose, and HbA1c, the study found no significant causal relation between LA and fasting insulin levels.
That's interesting. What does that imply?
It's a critical point because it suggests the protective mechanism isn't about LA making the pancreas just pump out more insulin. It's more likely related to improving insulin sensitivity. The ability of our tissues, like muscle and liver, to respond to insulin and dispose of glucose efficiently.
Okay, and this is where the study gets really, really interesting for me because it shows this kind of metabolic feedback loop. The researchers found a causal relationship that actually flows in both directions.
That's right. This was a fascinating part of the analysis. When they flipped the script and performed what's called a reverse MR analysis, basically treating type 2 diabetes as the exposure and the circulating LA levels as the outcome, they found that having T2D was causally correlated with reduced levels of circulating LA.
Okay, so let me just restate that to make sure I've got it. Genetically high LA protects you from getting T2D.
Correct.
But if you do end up developing T2D, your body's circulating LA levels actually drop. That sounds kind of counterintuitive. Why would LA levels fall once the disease is already established?
Yeah, seems backward at first. But the proposed explanation for this centers on the vast metabolic landscape of our gut microbiome. Other studies have shown that patients with T2D exhibit a significant, measurable increase in the abundance of certain bacterial genera, and most notably among them, is lactobacillus.
Okay, and what does lactobacillus have to do with linoleic acid?
Well, this genus of bacteria seems to promote the metabolic transformation of LA directly within the gastrointestinal tract.
And if LA is transformed by gut bacteria before it can even be absorbed?
Then less of the parent LA molecule makes it into the bloodstream. This effectively reduces the circulating levels of LA that we can measure in diabetic patients. So it's not that the low LA caused the diabetes in this case. Rather, the diabetes state, specifically the changes in the gut microbial ecosystem, is what's causing the low LA levels.
So it's a symptom. It's an indicator of the disease state, not the primary cause of it.
Exactly. And this bidirectional understanding, it really strengthens the argument for LA being metabolically protective to begin with.
All right, so given this strong causal link to prevention, we need to dive into the molecular why. What are the plausible mechanisms for how LA provides these metabolic benefits in our tissues?
We have several lines of evidence pointing to direct cellular action. Firstly, and this is fundamental, you have to remember that LA is essential for building cell membranes. When LA is correctly incorporated into the phospholipid structure of these membranes, it can significantly alter the membrane's fluidity.
It essentially changes the physical texture of the cell. Why does that matter for blood sugar?
Because the surface of the cell is where the insulin receptors live. By altering that fluidity, LA helps regulate the shape and the function of these receptors. It directly improves insulin sensitivity in critical metabolic tissues like muscle and fat. It just makes the cell surfaces better, more effective receivers for the insulin signals that are circulating in the blood.
Okay, so that's the direct structural mechanism. What about the signaling molecules that are involved?
Right, so secondly, high LA levels are strongly associated with increasing concentrations of a hormone called adiponectin.
Adiponectin. I've heard this called the friendly signal, or the protective hormone that's released by fat cells.
That's a good way to put it. We know that LA increases both total adiponectin and specifically a form called high molecular weight, or HMW adiponectin. This adipokine is crucial because it significantly improves insulin sensitivity, particularly through its beneficial effects on liver and skeletal muscle function.
So the higher LA levels are basically encouraging your fat tissue to release signals that help the rest of your body handle glucose better.
Absolutely. And then there's the third and probably most complex mechanism, which involves LA's metabolic derivatives. See, LA doesn't stay LA forever in the body. It gets processed by enzymes, and it eventually forms a substance called dihomogamma-linolenic acid, or DGLA.
And from DGLA.
From DGLA, a whole family of molecules is created, and these are powerful metabolic regulators.
Okay, give us the highlights. What are the key regulators?
The most notable ones are the prostaglandins. We see that prostaglandin E1, or PGE1, which is a DGLA metabolite, is known to strongly enhance insulin action. Then you have prostaglandin D2, PGD2. This molecule plays a really crucial role in regulating inflammation inside our white adipose tissue.
Inflammation in fat cells, that's a huge driver of T2D, so anything that reduces that is a big deal.
A very big deal. PGD2 encourages the macrophages, those are the immune cleanup cells in our tissues, to shift away from an inflammatory M1 state, which actively worsens insulin resistance, and towards an anti-inflammatory M2 state.
So PGT2 is essentially calming the immune system down in the fat cells, and that correlates positively with improved adipose insulin sensitivity.
Indeed. And finally, there's prostaglandin E2, or PGE2, which acts to both enhance overall insulin sensitivity and increase muscle glycolysis. That just means it promotes the muscle's ability to take up and burn glucose for energy.
Yeah.
So you take all these collective sophisticated actions together, and they strongly suggest that LA, when it's available to the body in a way that allows for a proper metabolism, is a very potent anti-diabetic nutrient.
Right.
So we've established this. Genetically, it looks like LA is metabolically beneficial when it circulates in high levels. But now, to truly understand the paradox of why the consumption of LA-rich oils has coincided with rising chronic disease, we have to zoom out. We have to look at the dramatic 20th century shift in American eating habits, and I mean, a change that is almost impossible to comprehend in its scale.
The scale of this transformation is what provides the necessary context for the whole paradox. We're not talking about a subtle shift, like from apples to oranges. We are talking about fundamentally restructuring the American diet in a single lifetime. And the most striking dietary modification relates to one single product, soybean oil.
The numbers are frankly stunning. You look at them and you think it has to be a typo. The estimated per capita consumption of soybean oil in the United States increased by over 1,000-fold.
1,000.
1,000-fold. If
Wow.
we look at the span from 1909 to 1999, consumption went from 0.009 kilograms per person per year to 11.64 kilograms per person per year. That's a 11.63-fold increase. It's just staggering.
That means soybean oil went from being virtually non-existent in the diet. I think it was contributing something like 0.006% of total energy in 1909.
Basically nothing.
To becoming a major calorie source, responsible for over 7% of our total energy intake by the end of the century. It is the very definition of a radical dietary change that was driven by industrial capacity.
And since LA is the primary fatty acid in soybean oil, this single industrial shift drove a massive systemic increase in the availability of LA in the food supply. Depending on how researchers modeled the original 1909 diet, the overall availability of LA increased somewhere between 158% and 223% between 1909 and 1999.
So we went from LA making up about 2.23% of our total energy intake, which is pretty consistent with a traditional human diet, to over 7% in 1999. And the source of that LA shifted completely. Soybean oil, which contributed less than 0.1% of total LA back in 1909, became the source of 43% of all dietary LA by 1999.
It became the dominant fat.
It became the dominant fat. And that change carries these profound metabolic consequences, primarily the severe skewing of the essential fatty acid balance, the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio.
Right. LA is the primary omega-6 fat, and its counterpart, alpha-linoleic acid, or ALA,
Yeah.
the primary omega-3 fat. And while ALA availability also increased a bit historically, it couldn't possibly keep pace with the massive flood of LA that was entering the food system.
So the total N6 to N3 ratio increased by 77%. It jumped from about 5.4 in that traditional 1909 model to almost 10 in 1999. Now, this ratio might sound a bit academic, but it is deeply relevant to our protective health status, isn't it?
It's extremely relevant because the long-chain omega-3 fats, EPA, and DHA, those are the highly protective molecules we associate with brain and heart health. They're created in the body from the shorter-chain ALA, and they use an enzyme called delta-6 desaturase. But here's the catch. LA and ALA compete fiercely for access to that exact same enzyme.
Okay, so if you suddenly flood the system with LA from soybean oil, the LA essentially wins the competition for the enzyme. It's elbowing out the protective ALA.
That's a perfect analogy. That's exactly what happens. High dietary LA concentrations impair the conversion of ALA into protective EPA and DHA. So the historical shift didn't just add a new fat to the diet, it actively undermined the body's ability to create its own protective fats.
And we can actually quantify that long-term depletion using a metric called the estimated omega-3 index.
We can. The omega-3 index is a really powerful metric. It reflects the concentration of EPA and DHA in our human cell membranes. So it's showing your actual tissue status, not just what you ate yesterday. Over the 20th century, the estimated omega-3 index decreased by a startling 54%.
To 54%.
It fell from over 8 in the traditional 1909 model to under 4 in 1999. That represents a systemic historical decline in the protective foundation of our human tissues.
That's the most memorable number here for me. A 1,000-fold increase in one fat source leads to our protective defense system being cut in half. It's just incredible to think that every single grandparent alive in 1909 was eating a fundamentally different diet at a chemical level than we are today.
And you have to ask,
Wait a second.
why did this happen so quickly? It wasn't primarily driven by health recommendations, not at first anyway. The seed oil boom was an industrial phenomenon. Soybean was just a very desirable crop. It's high yield, and it performs well because it fixes nitrogen into the soil, which is great for farmers.
But the real game changer was the technology that allowed them to process it so efficiently.
Absolutely. New processing techniques like solvent extraction allowed manufacturers to efficiently harvest enormous amounts of oil from the seed. But perhaps the most critical factor, and this is what most people don't realize, was the explosion in demand for soybean meal.
The meal, not the oil.
Yes, the meal. Soybean meal became the cheap, preferred protein source for the industrial livestock and poultry production boom that happened after World War II. So the oil became, in many ways, a massive, cheap, and unavoidable byproduct of a system that was really focused on producing cheap meat and eggs.
So industrial farming creates this monumental glut of cheap soybean oil. And then later, the public health recommendations to switch from animal fats to polyunsaturated fats,
Yeah.
which were then aggressively marketed. That just created the perfect storm for widespread adoption.
It was the perfect storm. The advice to consume PUFAs replaced one fat source with a substance that was increasing in availability for entirely unrelated economic reasons.
So we know that LA, genetically speaking, seems protective against diabetes, and we know that industrialization has flooded our diet with it. But now we have to face the core contradiction: the cardiovascular data. If the traditional hypothesis is correct, that replacing saturated fat with LA-rich oil should lower cholesterol and save lives, why does this so often fail in clinical trials?
The foundational doubt here really starts with challenging the premise that saturated fat is the singular primary driver of heart disease in the first place. I mean, do you remember that massive meta-analysis of 21 prospective epidemiologic studies? It tracked nearly 350,000 subjects for decades.
Let's revisit that key finding. What did the highest consumers of saturated fat show compared to the lowest consumers over all those years?
The conclusion was crystal clear. Intake of saturated fat was not associated with an increased risk of coronary heart disease, stroke, or overnight cardiovascular disease. The pooled estimates comparing the highest versus lowest quantiles of consumption were entirely neutral.
Okay, so if SFA is not the primary enemy we thought it was, then replacing it with LA must offer some kind of profound and reliable benefit to justify the recommendation and the massive dietary shift we just discussed.
That's the logical conclusion. The traditional hypothesis predicted that the SFA to LA substitution would lower cholesterol, slow down atherosclerosis, and dramatically reduce CHD events or death.
And the evidence.
The evidence is highly selective. Randomized controlled trials consistently and robustly confirm the very first step of that hypothesis. Replacing SFA with LA-rich oils effectively lowers serum total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol. That causal link is established. LA is effective at changing the number on your cholesterol panel.
But the key endpoint, actual clinical outcomes, death, heart attacks, that's where the evidence seems to just collapse.
Exactly. The RCTs fail to establish a consistent causal link between LA replacement and a meaningful reduction in CHD events or deaths. The cholesterol benefit, the proxy marker, it just does not reliably translate into a reduction in morbidity or mortality.
This failure, it must have forced researchers to go back and critically reevaluate some of the landmark trials from the 60s and 70s. I know many of them had incomplete or even unpublished data.
That's right. The recovery and reanalysis of this hidden data completely changed the narrative. The Minnesota Coronary Experiment, MCE, which was conducted from 1968 to 1973, is a prime example. The intervention group replaced saturated fat with high LA corn oil, and they successfully lowered serum cholesterol in all the subgroups, which was, considered a huge win at the time.
But when the full, unpublished data was finally recovered and analyzed decades later,
the paradoxical finding was that there was no clinical benefit in any group. In fact, the recovered MCE data showed a profoundly worrying inverse relationship. The participants who experienced the greatest reduction in their serum cholesterol actually had a statistically higher risk of death during the trial period.
Wait, hold on. If the number on the scale cholesterol goes down, but the death rate goes up, we have to look past the scale and question the entire mechanism. Did the autopsies from that study provide any further insight?
They did. At autopsy, the intervention group, the ones with a high LA corn oil diet, did not show any less atherosclerosis or fewer infarcts compared to the control group. The mechanism was broken. Lower cholesterol did not translate into better physical outcomes or less plaque formation.
And the findings from the reanalysis of the Sydney Diet Heart Study, or SDHS, were arguably even more alarming. That trial also replaced SFA with a high LA source. This time it was safflower oil.
That trial showed a significant reduction in serum cholesterol, consistent with all the other studies. But the high LA intervention group paradoxically led to increased risks of both CHD death and all-cause mortality. The hazard ratio for all-cause mortality was 1.62.
A 62% higher risk of death compared to the control group. That's not just neutral, that's actively detrimental. That strongly suggests that whatever benefit you got from lowering LDL mass was being completely outweighed by some form of harm delivered by the replacement oil itself.
So when systematic reviews look across all the adequately controlled randomized trials that specifically replaced SFA with LA-rich oils, the core public health advice, the conclusion is consistent. There is no reliable indication of benefit on coronary heart disease events or all-cause mortality.
The contradiction is just so stark. On one hand, we have genetic evidence that LA is metabolically protective against T2D, and on the other, we have clinical evidence that its substitution for SFA is often neutral or even harmful in terms of cardiovascular outcomes.
It seems like we have to treat the failure of LA to reduce mortality not as a failure of the LDL hypothesis itself, but maybe as an indictment of the chemical vulnerability of the fat we use for the substitution.
That's the exact pivot we need to make. The difference between LA's apparent TTD benefit and its CVD neutrality or harm likely lies in one crucial factor: LA's molecular destiny, which seems to be dominated by oxidation.
Right. We established that LA is an essential nutrient, but it's also what you might call a conditional toxin. And the reason for this is its vulnerability, which stems from its molecular structure.
Okay, so what makes it so fragile?
LA is a polyunsaturated fat, meaning it has multiple double bonds, these CH8 bonds. The bonds that link those double bonds are CH bonds, and they're chemically very weak. You can think of it like a metal fence that's been coated in a highly reactive paint. These weak points are just easy targets for free radicals, and that initiates a process called lipid peroxidation, or oxidative decay.
And given that 1,000-fold increase in LA consumption we discussed, this translates directly to a massive increase in potentially damaging oxidized LA derivatives floating around in our tissues.
Precisely. These oxidized linoleic acid metabolites, or OXLAMs as they're called, they are highly bioactive, and they've been linked to the pathogenesis of many chronic diseases. Not just CHD, but also things like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease or steatohepatitis, and even chronic inflammatory pain. They seem to be the molecular mechanism of toxicity.
This leads us directly to something called the oxidized linoleic acid theory of atherogenesis, or OXLA. This theory is the necessary bridge to reconcile the paradox. It explains why lowering LDL cholesterol with LA failed to reduce mortality in those trials like MCE and SDHS.
OXLAT basically posits that when dietary LA is consumed, especially from refined industrial sources, it incorporates rapidly into all of our circulating lipoproteins, particularly LDL, and into the arterial walls themselves. This is a crucial step. By incorporating all this vulnerable LA, the cell walls and the lipoproteins become drastically more susceptible to oxidative attack.
So the intervention achieves the good outcome. It lowers the total quantity of circulating LDL mass. But the remaining LDL that is still circulating is now chemically compromised.
That is the absolute core of the OXLA theory. The LA substitution simultaneously lowered the quantity of LDL, but it drastically increased the quality risk of the remaining lipoprotein pool by rendering it highly vulnerable to damaging oxidation. And this, in turn, accelerates the formation of oxidized LDL or OXLDL.
And OXLDL is the bad stuff. It's inflammatory, sticky, and a known driver of plaque formation.
It's the real villain in the story.
Yeah.
So we made the fat, we did have more dangerous, and that increased risk negated the benefit of having less of it overall. That neatly explains the MCE and SDHS failures. The mechanism of oxidative toxicity potentially negates the cholesterol reduction benefit entirely.
It's just amazing. We are dealing with an essential nutrient that, due to its chemical structure and the context of its industrial consumption, becomes a liability. It's good for glucose metabolism in its pure form, but dangerous when it's oxidized, which happens easily inside the body and, as we're about to see, before it even reaches the body.
And the complexity just deepens when we track the full metabolic cascade of omega-6 derivatives. We saw positive MR data for the parent LA molecule regarding diabetes, but what happens further down the chain when the body starts processing it?
Right, there are other metabolites.
That's where the AA conflict comes in. Another sophisticated MR analysis focused on adrenic acid, or AA, which is a later highly saturated derivative of omega-6 metabolism. And that study found that individuals with genetically higher serum AA levels had a clear greater risk for coronary heart disease events, myocardial infarction, and large artery stroke.
So, high levels of a later omega-6 metabolite are causally linked to increased cardiovascular risk. That completely contradicts the protective findings we saw for the parent LA molecule and T2D.
It's a direct contradiction. And furthermore, this genetically higher AA status was also associated with increased levels of fasting blood glucose and LDL-C, which contradicts the immediate protective findings of LA itself in the T2D models. It suggests that the stage of metabolism is critically important. The parent molecule may be protective, but certain downstream, highly saturated metabolites like AA appear to be detrimental.
And this entire problem is just compounded by that historical shift, the skewed N6 to N3 ratio.
We can't forget the metabolic competition. That 1,000-fold increase in LA consumption ensures that the protective omega-3 pathway is constantly being starved of enzyme access. And this results in that depleted protective status, that 54% decrease in the omega-3 index, which leaves the body far less resilient to the oxidative damage caused by all the LA metabolites.
So you have less defense, the N3s, against way more offense from the OX lands.
That's the perfect summary of the situation.
This realization that LA is a conditional toxin brings us directly to the real-world source of so many of these oxidized fats, the high-heat cooking and industrial processing of these oils. It's not just the LA content of the food, but how the LA-rich oil is treated before we ingest it.
Frying is arguably the most demanding chemical stress test we could subject our food to. When you subject oil to high temperatures, especially with air and moisture exposure from the food, it rapidly accelerates hydrolysis, polymerization, oxidation, and thermal alteration. This environment generates a complex, soupy mix of degraded products that we call polar compounds.
And the danger is magnified dramatically in commercial settings, isn't it? Where oils are reused repeatedly. It's a process known as discontinuous frying, which is typical of so many high-volume restaurants and fast food operations.
It is. The oil is heated, cooled, reheated, exposed to air, exposed to food particles for days or even weeks on end. That continuous abuse significantly increases the degradation. Many regulatory bodies set the maximum limit for used frying oil replacement at 25% total polar compounds.
And if you exceed that,
Exceeding that indicates severe degradation. The significant concern is that abused fats and oils that have been collected from fast food outlets often far, far surpass this limit, sometimes reaching values as high as 60% polar compounds. At that point, you're consuming mostly breakdown products, not oil.
so we're not just ingesting pure LA anymore, we're ingesting this soup of highly complex degradation compounds. Which specific components are the biggest nutritional and toxicological concern?
The compounds of concern are the non-volatile ones, the ones that remain in the oil after frying, get absorbed by the food, and are subsequently ingested. We can break them down into monomers and polymers. The oxidized tag monomers, things like hydroxy and epoxy fatty acids, are generally well absorbed, although some of the initial oxidation products like hydroperoxides are converted to more stable, less harmful forms in the gut.
Okay, what about the larger, more complex structures, the polymers?
The real problem, it seems, lies with the tag polymers, which are the major fraction found in highly used frying oils. These are large, complex molecules that research shows are poorly hydrolyzed by pancreatic lipase. That's the enzyme designed to break down fat. In studies involving highly abused oils, the hydrolysis values for these polymers were shockingly low, sometimes between only 11 and 42%.
So they don't break down and they don't get absorbed into the body like normal fat. But why is low absorption dangerous? It sounds like they would just be excreted.
And that's the critical subtlety. It's a great question. Low absorption means high levels of these complex, non-digested lipids are remaining in the gastrointestinal tract, and they're interacting with the intestinal lining and our microflora for extended periods.
All right.
These non-digested lipids, alongside the bile acids our body secretes, have a kind of detergent activity that can potentially injure the delicate intestinal mucosa, the lining of our gut.
So a prolonged chemical scouring of the gut lining.
Exactly. This sustained exposure to non-digested, highly altered lipids can disrupt the epithelial barrier, it can potentially trigger inflammation, and it can severely affect microflora metabolism. This could impact long-term gastrointestinal health and potentially contribute to systemic inflammation throughout the body.
Given the strong causal genetic correlation showing LA protects against T2D, the study authors actually recommend increasing LA intake as a primary preventative measure for type 2 diabetes. But how can we possibly reconcile that clinical recommendation with the CVD risks and these oxidation dangers?
This is the ultimate clinical challenge facing nutritionists today. The T2D recommendation is primarily based on that genetic analysis, which studies the fat in its circulating, generally healthy form. It suggests the nutrient LA is protective. However, the authors of that very study stress that this finding needs further research to validate its real-world clinical efficacy.
So even they are cautious.
Very cautious. We have to weigh the T2D benefit against the counter-evidence regarding CVD, the documented oxidative toxicity, and these real-world processing issues like abusive frying.
So the takeaway has to be highly nuanced. It sounds like we should distinguish between LA as a protective essential nutrient, which is likely beneficial when consumed in modest amounts from whole, healthy sources, and LA as a source of highly oxidized toxic compounds in industrially processed, repeatedly heated oils.
I think it's the only logical conclusion. Moderate consumption of oil under control, normal culinary practices is likely safe, especially when it's paired with a high omega-3 status to help counteract oxidation. But the high degradation levels found in abused oils from industrial sources absolutely warrant strict quality control and regulatory oversight. We have to focus on the toxicity of the altered fat, not just the parent molecule.
So after all of that, what does this all mean for the learner? We have navigated a genuinely complex and very contradictory scientific landscape here.
We have, and I think we've established that linoleic acid is a potent metabolic agent. The genetic evidence strongly supports its role in improving blood sugar control and lowering the risk of type 2 diabetes, provided it can be metabolized correctly. This confirms its fundamental role as an essential nutrient.
But the context of its consumption is everything. The massive historical 1,000-fold increase in LA consumption, primarily from these industrial seed oils, has actively impaired our body's protective mechanisms. And that led to that startling 54% decrease in protective omega-3 tissue status.
And critically, we found that when LA is subjected to high heat, especially in these industrial, discontinuous frying settings, it transforms into chemically damaging oxidized metabolites, the oxaliums and the tag polymers, which appear to be toxic and inflammatory.
And this oxidative toxicity is what likely negates the LDL-lowering benefits, explaining why replacing saturated fat with LA-rich oils so often fails to consistently reduce mortality in clinical trials.
The net effect on our health is thus determined by a really precarious metabolic equation. The measurable benefit derived from LA when replacing SFA versus the cumulative oxidative burden generated by LA's chemical instability and the resulting depletion of our protective N3 fats due to metabolic competition. It's a conditional toxin whose harm is entirely dependent on how it's sourced, processed, and cooked.
And that leads us to the final provocative thought for you to take away.
If we know that this dramatic dietary shift led to this profound, measurable depletion of our protective omega-3 status, and if we know that industrial use results in high levels of these dangerous, unabsorbed, oxidized compounds, the oxalams and polymers, then why is there still so little comprehensive analytical information available on the actual total intake and the biological fate of these damaging oxidized compounds that we consume every single day?
We can measure the LA in the blood, but we often can't measure the oxidized end products that might be doing the real cumulative damage. We're measuring the starting material, but we're not measuring the toxic waste.
Precisely. Defining the precise chemical structure and the actual levels of the multitude of non-volatile compounds generated from industrial frying that are present in our diet. That remains the crucial research assignment required to fully guarantee the safety of our modern seed oil-saturated food supply. The potential danger lies in the unmeasured toxicity.
An essential nutrient that is also a conditional toxin. That is the linoleic acid paradox. Thank you for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.